jazz opened my life as a musician. My name is Henson-Conant, and I started playing the harp as a young adult. I didn't read music at that time, so I started learning to read music with classical music. But very soon I realized that I needed more freedom. I needed to improvise and to express myself. At that time, there were maybe a handful of jazz harp players in the whole world, and none were around where I lived. So I started asking other instrumentalists to teach me how they did it. And I started watching them. And from there, I developed my own way of understanding jazz. And I discovered that to effectively learn jazz on the harp, it's completely different than learning it on any other instrument, which is why I have created a program specifically for teaching jazz to harp players. In my JazzForHarps program, we start with a set of warm-ups that are all about combining jazz rhythms and these chord progressions or key changes that you're going to see in jazz tunes. So you get used to making those changes, used to seeing them and identifying them and knowing what to do. Another thing that's really important in learning jazz on the harp is to choose the right tunes to start with. Because none of the standard jazz tunes were written for the harp. They were all written for other instruments. And some are more difficult than others. And every jazz tune has its own roadmap. That roadmap is the sequence of harmonies or chord changes that tune goes through. And some roadmaps are bumpier than others for the harp. When I first started to try to play jazz on the harp, I did not know that. And so I chose tunes. I had no idea they were complicated, and I couldn't play them. So I thought I just couldn't play jazz. Eventually, I figured out that I just wasn't choosing the right tunes to start with. I was choosing ones that had these really bumpy roadmaps. So I needed to start with tunes that were smoother for the harp and then develop my ability to play more complicated tunes. And that's why I created a starter list of jazz tunes for harpists. So you don't have to go through that process that I did. So you can start developing a jazz repertoire much more quickly than I did. Instead of spending 2 years trying to ace one really complicated tune so you can play it perfectly, which is just not what jazz is about. In JazzForHarps, we start with the tunes from the starter list, the tunes that I wish I'd started with. Because once I got it, jazz opened up the world to me. Once I started figuring out which tunes were more comfortable, I started playing with a bass player, then with a drummer. I created the Jazz Harp Trio. I started recording and playing all over Boston and New England and eventually all over the world. And when my band broke up, I could play all the tunes that everybody else knew because I knew the repertoire. So I started playing with other really great players. I just hired great players and they taught me how to play. And one day, the president of a jazz label saw me on TV and offered me a contract with one of the top jazz labels in the world. It was called GRP. It's Dave Grusin's label. And I became one of a very small group, maybe 2 or 3 jazz harp players who was touring internationally and recording on a major label. And by the way, I was the only woman instrumentalist on my label at all. So that was an incredible experience because of jazz. Eventually, I started to integrate jazz with symphonic music. I played with the Boston Pops. I created concertos that other harpists now perform. All of this was based on my journey that started with learning how to play straight-ahead jazz tunes. Because the principles and skills you learn in jazz will expand every part of your musical life. And that is why I love sharing what I learned. And that is also why I created JazzForHarps on 3 different levels. Because I've experienced it on 3 different levels. As a fledgling player, as an intermediate player, and as an advanced player, and eventually as professional. And I got value from every single level. My teaching is also unique because I play on both the pedal harp and the lever harp, and I've played jazz on both. So that means I can connect with players on any level, but also because I've been on all the levels, and also on both kinds of harps, because jazz is different on the pedal harp and the lever harp. Now, JazzForHarps is an online program. That means that you can access the basic video trainings anytime, day or night, any time zone, 24/7. It also is a live component where I answer your questions, where we play together. It's not just, here's the stuff, go do it. Because learning jazz is going to happen differently for each person, and you really need to be able to ask questions. For me, jazz has given me the ability to improvise with people all over the world, to open for Ray Charles, to improvise with Bobby McFerrin, to read jazz charts, to create music with other people. It all started with jazz. Jazz is a way of thinking and playing that opens you up, and it starts with understanding the rhythms, the roadmaps of the tunes, the harmony, and the improvisation. And those are the 4 foundations of Jazz for Harps. This is the program that I was looking for when I started. And now I have the joy of getting to share it with you.